Ireland is well known for its harsh winters, be it the blistering squalls that rage in from across the Atlantic, the biting frosts that blast away any plants still clinging to the fading winter sun, the occasional flurry of snow, or any of the 20 types of rain that batter this little island during those dark winter months. Luckily, our ancestors had more sense than to be going out in the freezing, soaking cold if they could help it. Traditionally, the winter was a period of rest and hibernation for the ancient peoples of Ireland, a time to conserve energy, to cozy up somewhere warm and feast on the bountiful harvests brought in from before the festival of Samhain. Stories were told by turf fires as wild winter winds howled outside, little faces peering out into the cold and wishing for warmer days. But for as hard as these winter months were, our ancestors always knew that the brighter days would one day return, that the sun would shine its life-giving rays on the frozen land, melting away their fears and troubles and bringing life back to their fields and forests, that the season of rebirth is coming, a time now known to most as spring, but in the ancient Celtic calendar it went by the name of Imbolc. The festival of Imbolc falls roughly halfway between the winter and summer solstices, tying in with the spring equinox and the return of light to Ireland. It's a time where greenery floods back into the land, when the dainty heads of the snowdrops poke up through the soil, blanketing the earth with brilliant white. It marked the beginning of lambing season for the shepherds, filling the once barren hilltops with little white clouds of dauntless determination and excitement to be alive. Farmers would begin to sow their fields, smiling down at the little green shoots that they know would provide so much sustenance and nourishment later in the year. For Imbolc is the season of fresh starts and new beginnings and would have been celebrated all across Ireland. Much of the festivities related to giving thanks to the one that they believed was responsible for this time of rebirth in Imbolc. Offerings of food or silver would have traditionally been brought to the waterways and wells of Ireland, places considered sacred to her. A triple goddess who goes by many forms and many names, but is most commonly known as Brigid. Now, Brigid is the daughter of the Dagda, the good god of Irish mythology, and a member of the mythical race of fairy folk known as the Tuatha Dé Danann. She was celebrated as a goddess of agriculture and is said to have had two great oxen, Fea and Femin, who would cry out whenever Ireland was being plundered. But she's also seen as a goddess of fire, revered by the smiths, but also by the artists of Ireland who relied on her fire for creative inspiration. For it is said that she would roam across the old roads, and when she came across a cold hearth, she would light a fire in it that would turn any musicians and poets gathered around it into some of the best in all of Ireland. But she's also a goddess of healing, due to the many stories of her bringing new life back to Ireland after the dark times of Samhain. She had a great cloak made of sunbeams that would nourish the ground, melting the frosts and reviving the colourful flowers of Imbolc, a welcome sight to all who beheld them. People would celebrate her coming by hanging triskelions woven of rushes or straw from their rafters, for this was a symbol of Goddess Brigid, representing her foundational role in the Celtic calendar of life, death, and rebirth. But contrastingly, Brigid is also a saint, known as Saint Bridget of Kildare. And quite often the stories of these two separate entities have merged together over the years. And there are many explanations for this, though one of the most popular beliefs is that as historically Ireland had a rich culture of storytelling through the oral tradition, there are very few written accounts of what life was actually like in ancient Ireland. Well, that was at least until the coming of Christianity to Ireland in the 5th century, when the monks and priests brought ink and parchment and began to write down their accounts of its history. And this is how the ancient texts came to be, like the Dinshankas, the lore concerning places, and Cormac's glossary of Irish terms, and the Laura Gavala, also known as the Book of Invasions. But the scribes responsible for creating these valuable relics of ancient knowledge were occasionally prone to converting the old stories of pagan Ireland into ones tying in more with Christianity. And a prime example of this is Goddess Brigid herself, a figure so revered and so important to the people of Ireland that the scribes knew that they could not simply erase her from history as they had tried to do with some of the other pagan deities. Instead, stories about the Goddess Brigid became known as stories about her new Christian counterpart, Saint Bridget of Kildare. And unusually for a female saint, her popularity outshined almost all of her male counterparts, really becoming second only to Saint Patrick himself, who was the one said to have brought Christianity to Ireland in the first place. And so, this is how the goddess became the saint, how the festival of Imbolc became St. Bridget's Day on the 1st of February, now celebrated as a national holiday in the Republic of Ireland, and how the woven triskelions became known as St. Bridget's Cross. Nowadays, the Celtic goddess Brigid has been largely replaced by Saint Bridget, as was the case with many ancient deities all across the world. But stories of the Triple Goddess do still exist, and it is one of those that I will tell you today. This is the original story of Brigid, and how she first brought the season of rebirth to Ireland during a time when it needed it most. Long, long ago, a great mist descended from the high air and enveloped the ragged shores of Ireland. And in this mist came forth a truly godly procession. A people so beautiful, so ethereal, so magical, that they must surely have come from another world. These were the people of the great goddess Danann, who would come to be known as the Tuatha Dé Danann. Their leader was Nuada, who was king of the Tuatha Dé Danann at that time, although in truth it was Manannán mac Lir who was the greatest of their lot, although he would never disgrace himself with such a thing as a kingship. But you can learn more about him in one of my other videos if you're interested. One of the others was Ogma, brother to the king, who taught them all how to write using the ancient tree language of Ogam. There was the king's other brother, kind-hearted Dian Ket, who was a master physician and healer. There was Goibnu the smith, who crafted magical weapons so sharp that few blades could ever stand against them. And there was the Dagda, who controlled the seasons with his magical harp and kept them all well fed and satisfied with his bottomless cauldron. And then there was his daughter, Brigid, among the most radiant and beautiful of them all. She was both fierce warrior and compassionate healer both, known as the fiery arrow of the Tuatha Dé Danann for her flame-red hair. And as more of their magical procession landed in Ireland, they all looked around at its emerald grass and fertile soil and knew that this land was to be their new home. But little did they know that at that time Ireland was inhabited by another people, the firbolgs, the men of bags who had come to Ireland after fleeing slavery in far-off Greece. Now, Ireland is a relatively small country, and there's not a whole lot of room for two separate peoples to coexist comfortably. Or at least that's what the leaders of the Tuatha Dé Danann believed anyway. And so, when a peaceful arrangement could not be settled between the two, a truly enormous and awful battle transpired, which came to be known in the annals of Ireland as the First Battle of Moy-Tura. This story in itself is one of Ireland's most significant and really deserves its own video to do it proper justice. But the fact of the matter was that the firbolgs were really no match against the Tuatha Dé Danann. They had never faced anything like them before, for the Tuatha Dé Danann did not fight or die like normal folk. They were people of magic, of enchantments and spells. Really, they barely seemed like people at all, but something far more mythical that transcended the realms of possibility altogether. And so in the end, the poor firbolgs were decimated by the Tuatha Dé Danann after 4 brutal days of battle. But they did not give up without a fight. No, for in their furious determination to defend their home from these invaders, one of their champions, strong-armed Sreng, had inflicted a terrible wound on King Nuada of the Tuatha Dé Danann. With all the strength of a cornered animal, Sreng had completely severed Nuada's arm clean from his body in one vicious swing of his great axe. Now, as I said before, the Tuatha Dé Danann were a magical people. That's true. But something as serious as an entire arm being chopped off was a big deal even to the likes of them. Completely flabbergasted with what had happened, Nuada picked up his severed arm, and in the chaos of the battle ran over to his brother, Dian Ket, the physician of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And he said, "Dian Ket, brother, look, you've got to help me here. That big firbolg lad, he came at me and clean chopped my arm off. And look, I know we're the mystical Tuatha Dé Danann, who are people of magic that transcend the realms of possibility and all that, but I can't lie. I'm losing a heck of a lot of blood here. And I'd much rather have 2 arms than 1, so you've got to help me, brother." Well, to Dian Ket, the matter of restoring an arm that had been completely chopped off by a great axe was as simple an operation as removing a tiny splinter from a little finger. He said, "Don't worry yourself, Nuada, I'll get you sorted out, no problem."
And quit your gurning, you're a king after all, you've got an example to set.
I mean, honestly, for goodness sake. And so Nuada sucked it up and bravely let Dian Ket work his magic. And before he knew it, he was looking down to see a brand new arm in place of where his old one had been. And better yet, this one was made of solid silver, which no one could deny looked pretty kingly and official. So magnificent was Nuada's new arm that from that day on he became known as Nuada of the Silver Arm. He leapt up to his feet and embraced Dian Ket, almost crushing him with his powerful new arm, and said, "Oh, thank you, brother. Oh, I owe you big time for that." Well, Dian Ket was barely able to speak with the air that had been squeezed out of him, but he just about managed to squeak out, "No problem, Nuada, no problem. All in a day's work, eh? Now, please, let me go." Thank you. But for as great as his new arm was, Nuada's problems hadn't been entirely fixed by the deft hands of his brother. For the Tuatha Dé Danann had a law that only someone who was at the very peak of physical perfection could rule over them as king. And yes, before the battle, no one could deny that Nuada exuded the very peak of masculine performance. He was strong and handsome and had biceps so large that they could snap a tree in half as though it were a twig. But now, he had been tainted. To the Tuatha Dé Danann, a fickle bunch really, let's be honest, this silver was not natural. It gleamed and glistened, yes, but it did not disguise the fact that Nuada had lost something out there on that blood-soaked battlefield of Moitura. Something that seemingly not even the magical powers of Dian Ket could repair. So they refused Nuada as king. He had to step down to allow them to search for a new candidate to rule over them. But luckily for them, they did not have to search for long. For standing in their midst was the most beautiful man that anyone in the Tuatha Dé Danann had ever seen. Quite possibly the most beautiful man to ever set foot on the turbulent shores of Ireland. He had a slender figure, yes, sleek and elegant, but there was strength there too, and confidence. Well, maybe a little too much confidence to tell the truth, but that's often the way with kings, as we know. He commanded respect, but also adoration and reverence. His clean-shaven jaw was perfectly shaped, immaculately angled as though it had been meticulously chipped from marble. His soft skin was free of any imperfections, the very image of youthful vigor, and an enchanting pair of eyes shone bright like gemstones from underneath his long, flowing locks, waving elegantly with every movement of his comely body. Even the Tuatha Dé Danann, this godlike race of fairy folk, felt inferior to gaze upon such a man. This was Bres, who rather unsurprisingly became known to most as Bres the Beautiful. Well, that's that then, they all thought. What more could you want in a king? Ah, well, happy days. Let's put a crown on his head and call it a night, roll out the cider and keep it flowing, lads, eh? Well, after all, the Tuatha Dé Danann had much to celebrate. A great victory over the firbolgs and the coronation of a new king, the likes of whom had never been seen before and probably never would again. I'm sure it was a bit unlucky for those other lads. None of them were bad-looking fellas by any means, but it really seemed to all those gathered there as though there was not another soul in the world that could equal Bres, that could stand in his shadow even, to scrape the dirt off the boots of this spectacular new king of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Not another soul. Well, except perhaps for one. Brigid, the beautiful young daughter of the Dagda, whose grace and elegance truly was the stuff of legend. Her fiery, flame-red hair was just as free and unruly as the element it represented, soaring up into the sky as though she were eternally burning. It was a magnificent contrast to her gorgeous emerald green dress that draped down her body and kissed the earth with daisies and snowdrops everywhere she stepped. Her face itself was as pure as her soul, for unlike many of her people, Brigid was flawless both inside and out. Truly, it seemed as though there would never be as perfect a match as there was between these two divine entities, the very storybook images of what a king and queen should be. And so that was how young Bres, who had previously been the champion of the Tuatha Dé Danann in their battle against the firbolgs, became their new king, and took fair Brigid as his bedazzling queen consort. Now, Bres and Brigid's reign started off well, for it began with peace. Many of the war-ravaged Tuatha Dé Danann who were still drunk on blood from the great battle had wanted to eradicate those that remained of the firbolg, as did King Bres himself. But Brigid could not allow this wanton bloodshed to continue, to condone the genocide of an entire people who were already defeated and really only consisted of the wounded and those who could not defend themselves. So, in complete defiance of the traditional role of a queen in those days, Brigid stood up to those great warriors in defense of the ragged remnants of the firbolg. And so passionate and righteous was her plea that none in good faith could disobey their new queen, not even Bres himself. And so, it was Brigid's compassionate heart that had spared the lives of the firbolg, rather generously bestowing an entire quarter of Ireland to them. Which is not bad considering the fact that they had initially bargained for half before the battle began. And the quarter of Ireland that the firbolg chose came to be known over the years as Connacht, out in the west, where a certain Queen Maeve would one day come to rule over the great fortress of Cruachan. But hey, that is absolutely a story for another day. And under the leadership of Strong-Arm Sreng, the very same who so definitively ended the kingship of Nuada, the firbolg gathered their numbers and moved to Connacht to nurse their wounded and rebuild their lives. But no sooner after the war had ended did another problem arise to test the new king and queen of the Tuatha Dé Danann. For way out in the salty waters that crash against Ireland's most northerly coast, the land that would eventually become known as Donegal, there lived a truly monstrous people, known as the Fomorians, the Fui Murra. Well, they barely looked like people at all, to tell the truth, as they were more fish than human. They were a slimy, scaly folk, often grotesquely maimed with deep gashes and rotten stumps where hands and feet would normally be. Their eyes had swollen into revolting, bulbous globes, enormous slitted pupils gleaming out of the jelly of their orange eyes. For so long battered Donegal's coast that they seem to have been completely changed by that darkness. They had dwelled in those murky waters from way back before the Tuatha Dé Danann first set foot on Ireland, and they were not in the least bit pleased with their new overlords. But the Fomorians had gotten on really quite well with the peace-loving firbolgs. They had kept to themselves and were humble people who did not seek trouble. They cared for and respected the land and were happy with what they had and did not lust for more. And so the Fomorians were content to leave Ireland to the firbolgs. But these new Tuatha Dé Danann, they were a proud people. Too proud for the Fomorians' liking. They were always prancing around, making such a racket because of course sound travels much further and louder underwater, acting so high and mighty as though they were so much better than everyone else with all their magical artifacts and infuriatingly good looks. Well, the Fomorians had magical treasures of their own. Unfortunately, not so much the good looks part, although I'm sure the more fishy you were, the better in Fomorian society. For they were ruled over by a true monster, an absolutely enormous giant known as Balor. Now, Balor had a secret. He was a cyclops, and his one gigantic central eye was bigger than any chariot wheel on the entire Isle of Ireland. He had to keep it closed most of the time. If he ever opened this cursed eye, he would unleash a truly awful power that would decimate anyone unlucky enough to behold it. And so he was known as Balor of the Evil Eye, a nightmarish figure who would one day go on to inspire the great Dark Lord of the land, Mordor. And to remind everybody who's really in charge, Balor had demanded a tribute from the Tuatha Dé Danann, and it was a hard tax that he put on them at that. He wanted a third part of their corn, a third part of their milk, and a third part of their children. He did not want there to be smoke rising from a single roof in Ireland that was not paying tribute to Balor and the Fomorians. And much to everyone's surprise, comely King Bres, this mighty figure, just simply obliged, without putting up any sort of a struggle whatsoever. Huh. Well, this didn't go down too well with the rest of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Oh no, I mean, after all, they just fought hard with tooth and nail to win this country, and now they were going to give even more of it away to a people who had won no victory over them whatsoever, who had no right to take from the mighty Tuatha Dé Danann? No, this did not go down well, and in fact, now that they all had to think about it, there was actually quite a few things that Bres was doing that just felt a bit wrong to the Tuatha Dé Danann. For one, despite Brigid's protests, he was in no way as open-handed to his people as he was to the Fomorians. The greatest warriors of the Tuatha Dé Danann who had helped to win his throne were never treated with due respect by their young king. Their knives were never greased in his house, and there was no smell of ale on their breath upon leaving, however often they might visit. And in his house itself there was no merriment or joy of any sort, really. No poets, no singers or harpers whatsoever. And the only work that these great warriors were doing now was menial labor for the king. Tasks like keeping Bres's fire stocked with wood and building raths, the ancient stone forts for him. Brigid herself was outraged by this complete lack of care for her own people, but Bres wouldn't hear any of it. After all, he was the king, and it was up to everyone else to give tribute to him and not the other way around. Bres's allegiance to the Fomorians might seem strange considering his heritage with the Tuatha Dé Danann, although Bres had a secret that no one else knew. Only his mother, Eri, had been one of the Tuatha Dé Danann. His father was called Ilatha, and he was a prince of the Fomorians. And looking at Bres, well, it's clear to see which side of the family he got most of his genes from, but for all his life, Bres had been torn between both sides of his dual heritage, like a ship swaying back and forth over a turbulent sea. But now that he had actually assumed the kingship of the Tuatha Dé Danann and had all this power at his disposal, it seemed as though he had forsaken his mother's people entirely. And after 7 long years of Bres's reign, the Tuatha Dé Danann had had just about enough of it. So, in a pretty mad turn of events, they exiled Bres from Ireland and reinstated the deposed Nuada as king of the Tuatha Dé Danann once again. For in the 7 years that had passed since the first battle of Moytura, wise Dian Ket had managed to swap Nuada's silver arm for one of flesh and blood, sculpting it with his own hands and a fair dose of magic too. So as far as the Tuatha Dé Danann were concerned, Nuada was now right as rain and in perfect shape to lead them once more. They were glad to see the honest face of one of their own, a true member of the Tuatha Dé Danann through and through, after the misery that Bres's reign had brought them all. But this did not solve all their problems, for Brigid and Bres had a child together during that short and sad reign. A child who was called Ruadán, a spirited young boy with the fiery hair and passion of his mother, and the stubbornness of his father, and the good looks of both of them. But it was his father that he truly idolized. And when the time came to pick between the two of them, when the winds of change blew cold across the ragged hills and heathland of Ireland, it was Bres that Ruadán chose to follow. This left Brigid heartbroken. But what could she do? She'd always told her son to follow his heart and not let anyone restrain his great potential, for she saw a hero in him, a great leader, one who may one day become a king of his own, perhaps. And what a great king he would be. But alas, he had not chosen to follow her. And so he and his father had journeyed all the way to the royal court of Balor, high up in the great tower of Tor Mór on Donegal's Tory Island. There, Bres persuaded Balor to go to war with the Tuatha Dé Danann, to rid the world of their pompous arrogance once and for all, and to show who really holds dominion over the Isle of Ireland. Well, Balor, with all his might and power, thought that this was a great idea. He had also been growing sick of the Tuatha Dé Danann and was more than happy to wipe them off the face of the earth with his demonic, cyclopic eye. And so, war was once more on its way to Ireland. Still, only a distant hum on the horizon for now, but it would grow and spread fast like a virus, and Brigid knew it. She felt ashamed and exasperated with this treacherous man whom she had married, but now she knew that she had to protect her own people and hoped that the bloodshed would be kept to a minimum. She remembered all too well those 4 horrific days of fighting during the first battle of Moytura, and all those lives lost, and for what? For 7 years of unhappiness and ruin as Bres leached away the fortunes and the souls of the Tuatha Dé Danann to his aquatic kin? No, she was in no hurry to repeat such a mistake again, and she would do whatever it took to protect her people, no matter the cost. And so, in no time at all really, King Nuada had ordered his warriors to begin preparing for the dark work of war once again. Dian Ket and Brigid gathered all the healing herbs that they could find and made all manner of healing draughts and potions, day in, day out, barely sleeping at all. But Dagda played his harp and played it true, inspiring all those in the camp of the Tuatha Dé Danann and filling them with vim and vigor and hope that they would once again be victorious. Lukta, the carpenter, and Credna the brazier would make the shafts and rivets for their spears, while great Goibnu the smith forged the spearheads so sharp that they would cut through flesh and bone as though they were nothing. And it was for this exact reason that it was Goibnu the smith that the fomorians were most wary about. They reckoned that if they quenched the flame of their enemy's forge, then they would have no weapons with which to fight them. They would be as helpless as cattle for the slaughter, or whatever underwater equivalent the Fomorians used for cattle. And the reason that they knew of Goibnu's talents, of his comings and goings on each day, was because the Fomorians had sent a spy into the camp of the Tuatha Dé Danann, one who knew its layout like the back of their hand. For this is where they'd grown up, in what had once been their home. Yes, the Fomorians had sent Bres and Brigid's son, young Ruadon, to spy on the Tuatha Dé Danann, and not only that, but to kill Goibnu, the smith. Goibnu, who had given Ruadon his first sword, laughed with him and acted like a surrogate uncle to the young boy. And now Ruadon had been instructed to put an end to him. Such a strange situation. Ruadon did not know really what to think about it, what to do. But these were indeed strange times, where family must fight family, and he knew deep down that above all else he could not let his father down. So, Ruadon approached Goibnu, who was still busily smithing away as he always was, and Ruadon asked him to make him a spear. Goibnu, perhaps delirious from so much work and toil, or just from sheer joy to see Ruadon again, did not really think much of it. He of course obliged, stopping what he had been doing before, and began to forge Ruadon a shiny new spear of his own. Ruadon sat there patiently and watched Goibnu work, the very image of a proud and confident son of a king, but inside his nerves were wrecked. And when Goibnu had finished and the spear had cooled, he handed it to Ruadon. And what a fine spear it was. No surprise really, for it had been made by one of the greatest smiths to ever beat a hammer on the Isle of Ireland. Ruadon tossed it up into the air a few times, got a feel for its weight and balance. And then before even he knew what had happened, he had thrown it as hard as he could. He looked up at the path in which he had hurled the spear and noticed with some confusion really that it had ended up lodged deep in the stomach of Goibnu. Goibnu didn't really seem to know what had happened either. He had been staring at Ruadon, but now he glanced down at the spear in his belly and the dark patch of blood that was welling up around it. He went to speak, but instead just made a kind of sickening bubbling noise right at the back of his throat. And then suddenly he grabbed the shaft of the spear with both hands and pushed it all the way through his body. A horrific, primal, gurgling splutter racked out from his mouth as the spear came all the way out through his back. He held it in his hands for a few moments, the shaft slick with his own blood, staring at Ruadon with disbelief. And then, blinded by pure vengeance and betrayal, he took aim and let the spear fly with all the strength he had left in his body. It fizzed through the air before hitting Ruadon with a hollow thud, puncturing deep into the young boy's heart. Ruadon's eyes bulged wide and his mouth flopped open like a fish as the two stood there like statues for a few more moments at Goibnu's forge. And then Ruadon crumpled to the floor, and Goibnu was not long in following him. And when they were discovered the next day, Brigid could barely even register what it was that had actually happened. Here was her beloved son, come back from far off Tory Island, back home to her. But he had been killed before she could even tell him how much she'd missed him, how much she had hoped that he would return to her one day and grow into the good man that she knew he would be. But all that was gone now. All those golden moments of happiness in the future had been snuffed out just as surely and definitively as the fire had been in Goibnu's forge. This was a loss so great that Brigid was unable to articulate it into words. So instead, she just screamed. She cried out in the chill morning, her voice waking the sleepers, piercing through every building and every tent and every soul in that camp. A cry that was so sorrowful, so raw and just real. One that would be repeated time and time again by those who had lost someone who was not only dear to them, but was a physical part of them. A wail that would be channeled and perpetuated by mourners in Ireland for generations to come. This kind of sudden release of unfiltered emotion became known over the years as keening, one synonymous with the terrifying screeches of the Banshee, who I made a video about a few months ago. But it was Brigid, on that cold day in an age long past, who was the first one to keen. But despite this unimaginable loss, Brigid did not let the death of her son break her. No, if anything, it only stoked the fire in her soul even further, made her that much more determined to put an end to Bres's oppressive war and the evils that he had inflicted on her family. Brigid took up Goibnu's fallen hammer, reignited his forge and started hammering down on that anvil as hard and true as she could, shaping the molten steel into weapons that were far sharper and stronger than even those that great Goibnu had created. In fact, she was so skilled as a smith that she would eventually become known as the goddess of fire, her unquenchable flame igniting the fires in blacksmiths' forges that still burn across Ireland to this day. And when she had finished and the time for the fighting came during the second battle of Tuatha, she used those weapons to great effect, chopping, slicing, eviscerating any fomorian unlucky enough to face her fiery fury. Like an elemental force of pure destruction, she ravaged that battlefield. But some of the other warriors of the Tuatha Dé Danann were not quite so unstoppable. Whenever she saw one of her own lying injured or dying on that battlefield, she would instantly go to them and rekindle the life back into them with her healing hands, warmth and light returning to their rigid bodies like the golden rays of the spring sun, reviving the land after a bitter winter. She and Dianket worked together to heal anyone they could. So effective and bewildering were her abilities that she became known also as the goddess of healing. And after the battle was over, and the broken detritus and debris of war festered over the blood-soaked battlefield of Tuatha, she took her great sunbeam cloak and bathed the tortured land in it. And where before there had been death and decay, now flowers blossomed, greenery bloomed, crops and cattle once again flourished in a new land of hope and prosperity. And for this, Brigid also became known as the goddess of agriculture, so sacred to the people of Ireland, who had learned from her to tend and respect the land so that it would in turn nourish and feed them. For her actions in the second battle of Tuatha, Brigid became a triple goddess, one who is revered by her people above all others, for she ended that time of death and cold and loss and brought in new life to replace it, as she still does to this day, year in, year out, bringing an end to the dark days of Samhain and ushering in Imbolc, the time of new beginning, of fresh air and bright colors, of happiness and hope, bringing the life-giving fire of the sun back to her people so that they may once again rear their cattle and grow their fields. And for this, Brigid has outlasted virtually all of her kin in the Tuatha Dé Danann. For when they were eventually forced to flee Ireland and retreat into the fairy hills known as the She to find a new home in the other world of Tir na Nog, many of them have since been forgotten, replaced by a new god, their stories merging with those of the new religion, and none more so than Brigid herself. But while their names are now only remembered by a select few on ancient rock and the old place names of Ireland, Brigid's name has lived on. Either as a goddess or as a saint, her name is one that is revered by her people near and far, and every year her story of loss and new growth is celebrated across the Isle of Ireland and beyond. For without her, the Emerald Isle would not be green. And because she had lost her own son, Brigid is said to watch over and care for mothers, all while acting as a mother figure to all the children of Ireland. Brigid's cross is one of the most recognizable symbols of our country, as it will no doubt be for many more years to come. For as long as there is Ireland, there will always be Brigid, Brig, Brida, the Triple Goddess.